The auctioneer's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. The crowd pressed forward, stinking of tobacco and sweat. Josiah McKenna stood at the back of the weathered platform, sawdust thick under his boots. Wind slammed the loose boards of Millerville's auction house, rattling the tin roof like hail. His calloused hands gripped the brim of his hat as he watched the proceedings with growing unease. This wasn't a cattle auction or a land sale. This was something darker. "Next lot," the auctioneer bellowed, his voice cutting through the murmur of bidders. One female, approximately 16 years. Bond papers say she's skilled in domestic work. A girl was led onto the platform, her wrists bound with hemp rope. Dirt streaked her face, and her brown hair hung in matted tangles around her shoulders. Her dress, once blue, was torn and stained from weeks on the trail. She kept her eyes down, but something about the curve of her jaw made Josiah's breath catch. The crowd leaned in like vultures. Men in dusty coats called out crude assessments of her worth. Josiah felt his hands clench into fists. "What am I bid?" the auctioneer continued. "Starting at 50 cents. $1, called a heavyset man in a stained vest. Josiah studied the girl's profile. A memory flickered. A 10-year-old with pigtails running through tall grass, laughing as she chased fireflies. His chest tightened. $1.50, another voice shouted. The girl lifted her head for just a moment, and Josiah saw her eyes. Green as spring leaves, with that same determined set he remembered from childhood. The world seemed to tilt beneath his feet. "I recognize that face," he whispered. Then louder, his voice carrying across the platform. $2. The crowd turned to stare at the tall lumberjack who'd outbid them all for what they considered damaged goods. The auctioneer's gavel hesitated in midair. "Going once at $2, the man called, clearly expecting another bid. Silence stretched like a held breath. The girl looked directly at Josiah for the first time, and he saw recognition flicker in her eyes, followed immediately by fear. "Sold to the gentleman in the back." Josiah pushed through the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs. 20 years. 20 years since the Apache raid that had torn his family apart, since he'd watched his little sister disappear into the dust and chaos. He'd searched for months, following every lead, every rumor. The territorial marshal had finally declared her dead. But here she stood, alive and bound like livestock. The auctioneer handed him the bond papers with a greasy smile. "Pleasure doing business. She's all yours, mister." Josiah's eyes never left the girl as he approached. She stood perfectly still, but he could see the tremor in her hands. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Sarah," she whispered, then quickly added, "Sir." "Sarah McKenna?" Her eyes widened. The fear deepened. "I won't hurt you," Josiah said, reaching slowly for the rope around her wrists. "I'm your brother." She jerked back as if he'd struck her. "No, my brother's dead. They told me—" Her voice cracked. "They said the whole family was killed." Josiah's fingers stilled on the knots. The Apache who'd taken her had lied, probably to break her spirit, make her easier to control. Or maybe the traders who'd eventually sold her to white settlers had crafted the lie to prevent escape attempts. "I'm alive, Sarah. I've been looking for you." He worked the rope free and let it fall to the dusty platform. Red welts marked her wrists where the hemp had chafed. She rubbed them absently, still staring at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "You were 10. Josiah continued. "You had a rag doll named Molly with yellow yarn hair. You used to sneak cookies from Ma's jar and leave crumbs on your pillow. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the dirt. Josiah. The word came out broken, barely audible. Yeah, little sister. It's me. She collapsed against his chest, sobbing. Josiah wrapped his arms around her, feeling how thin she'd become, how her shoulders shook with years of held-back grief. The crowd around them muttered and dispersed, moving on to the next lot. But Josiah didn't care. He'd found her. After 2 decades of searching, of wondering, of living with the hollow ache of loss, he'd found her. How? Sarah pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. How did you survive? I was in the north pasture when they came, Josiah said. By the time I got back to the house, he trailed off. No need to describe what he'd found there. The burned timber, the scattered belongings, the silence that stretched like a wound across the prairie. Sarah nodded. She understood. The Apache traded me to Comancheros after 2 years. Then I was sold to a Mexican family in Santa Fe. When the husband died, his widow sold me again to pay debts. Her voice held the flat tone of someone who'd learned not to expect kindness. Josiah felt anger rise in his throat like bile, but he forced it down. Anger wouldn't help her now. You're safe, he said. You're coming home with me. Home? Sarah looked at him with something like wonder. You have a home? Built a cabin up in the timber country, about 50 miles north of here. Got a logging operation, some land. He gestured toward his wagon, loaded with supplies from town. It's not much, but it's ours now. They walked to the wagon in silence, Sarah staying close to his side. Josiah helped her onto the wooden seat, noting how she flinched when he moved too quickly. Years of bondage had taught her to expect rough handling. As they rolled out of Millerville, Sarah spoke again. I used to dream about you. About all of you. Sometimes I'd wake up and forget where I was, and for just a moment I'd think I was back in our old house, with Ma making breakfast and Pa reading his paper. I dreamed about you too, Josiah admitted. Never stopped believing you were alive somewhere. The wagon wheels creaked over rutted dirt as they climbed into the foothills. Pine trees rose around them, their green scent sharp and clean after the dust of town. Sarah breathed deeply, and some of the tension left her shoulders. Tell me about the cabin, she said. Josiah found himself smiling for the first time in months. It's got 2 rooms and a loft. Stone fireplace that draws real good. There's a creek runs right behind it, cold enough to keep milk fresh even in summer. Do you have neighbors? Few families scattered through the valley. Good people, mostly. The Hendersons have a spread about 5 miles east. They've got 3 daughters, one about your age. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Will they accept me when they learn what I was? You weren't anything but stolen, Josiah said firmly. Anyone who thinks different can answer to me. They made camp that night beside a small stream. Josiah built a fire while Sarah washed in the creek, scrubbing away years of grime and shame. When she returned, her hair was clean and braided, and she changed into a spare shirt from his pack. It hung loose on her frame, but she looked more like the sister he remembered. Over beans and hardtack, Sarah told him about her years of captivity. The Apache had treated her harshly at first, but she'd learned their ways, become useful. The Mexican family had been kinder. The Senora had taught her to read and write Spanish. The last owner, a cruel trader named Welch, had worked her like a mule and beaten her when she was slow. He said he was taking me to California to sell to a whorehouse, Sarah said, staring into the fire. I thought that was how I'd die, used up and forgotten in some mining camp. Josiah felt his jaw clench. Where's this Welch now? Dead. Cholera took him last month in Kansas. That's when his widow sold me to the auction house. Sarah looked at him directly. I'm glad he's dead, Josiah. Does that make me wicked? Makes you human, Josiah replied. Some men deserve what they get. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the creek bubble over stones and the soft hoot of an owl in the distance. Sarah pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. I used to wonder what you'd grown up to be, she said. I imagined you as a sheriff or a rancher. Never thought lumberjack. Learned the trade in Oregon Territory. Good work for a man who likes his solitude. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the dark. What about you? What did you want to be before? A teacher, Sarah said without hesitation. I wanted to have a schoolhouse and teach children to read. Foolish dream for a frontier girl, I suppose. Not foolish at all. Valley could use a school. Most folks have to send their kids to Millerville, and that's a hard ride in winter. Sarah looked at him sharply. You think they'd let me teach, after everything? I think they'd be lucky to have you. You speak 3 languages, and you've seen more of the world than most of them ever will. Hope flickered in her eyes, fragile as candlelight. I'd like that. I'd like to be useful again, but in a good way. The next morning brought rain, a steady drizzle that turned the dirt road to mud. They made slow progress, the wagon wheels bogging down in the deeper ruts. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, but the air held the promise of more to come. They crested a hill, and Josiah pointed ahead to where smoke rose from a chimney nestled among tall pines. There, that's home. The cabin was larger than Sarah had expected, built of thick logs with a wide front porch. A vegetable garden stretched along one side, and chickens pecked in a fenced yard. It looked solid and welcoming, nothing like the rough shelters she'd known for most of her life. It's beautiful, she breathed. They pulled up to the porch, just as a woman emerged from the cabin next door. She was middle-aged with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried a covered dish in her hands. Josiah McKenna, where have you been? I've been bringing soup for 3 days, thinking you'd taken sick. She stopped short when she saw Sarah. Oh, I didn't know you had company. Mrs. Henderson, I'd like you to meet my sister, Sarah. The woman's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Sister? But I thought you said your family was all killed. So did I, Josiah said simply. Turns out I was wrong. Mrs. Henderson set down her dish and came closer, studying Sarah with kind but curious eyes. You favor him around the eyes, she said finally. And you look like you could use a good meal. Come inside, both of you. I'll heat this soup. Sarah hesitated, but Josiah took her arm gently. It's all right. Mrs. Henderson's good people. The interior of the cabin was warm and clean, with handmade furniture and colorful quilts. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and shelves lined with books stood against one wall. Sarah ran her fingers along the book spines, marveling at the titles. You read? Mrs. Henderson asked, ladling soup into wooden bowls. Yes, ma'am. English and Spanish. Wonderful. We've been needing someone to help teach the children. Most of us can barely manage our letters, and the boys especially need work with their numbers. Sarah shot a glance at Josiah, who smiled encouragingly. I'd be happy to help, she said. Over the next few weeks, Sarah began to settle into her new life. She helped Josiah with the household tasks, learning to cook on the wood stove and tend the chickens. The Henderson daughters visited often, and gradually Sarah began to make friends among the Valley families. But the past wasn't easily buried. Sarah would sometimes wake in the night, crying out from nightmares. She flinched when men spoke sharply, and loud noises sent her into trembling fits. Josiah was patient, giving her space when she needed it, staying close when she needed that instead. One evening in late autumn, as they sat by the fire reading, Sarah set down her book and looked at him seriously. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about what happened to me. All of it." Josiah closed his own book. "You don't owe me any explanations." "I do, though. If we're going to be family again, really family, you need to know what kind of person I've become." She told him about the compromises she'd made to survive, the small betrayals and moral failures that had kept her alive. She spoke of learning to steal food when she was starving, of lying to protect herself, of the times she'd been forced to watch others suffer without being able to help. "I'm not the little girl you remember," she finished. "That girl died in the raid. I'm someone else now, someone harder." Josiah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. Finally, he spoke. "You want to know what I did the winter after you were taken? I tracked down 3 Apache warriors who were raiding homesteads south of here. Caught them camped by Willow Creek." Sarah waited, sensing there was more. "I could have brought them to the territorial marshal. Should have. Instead, I killed them in their sleep." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "Told myself it was justice, but really it was just revenge. Been carrying that weight ever since." He looked at her directly. "We all do what we have to do to survive, Sarah. All of us carry things we're not proud of. Doesn't change who we are underneath." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "How can you be so sure?" "Because you're sitting here worrying about it. Bad people don't worry about being bad." Spring brought new challenges. Word had spread through the territory about the lumberjack who'd found his long-lost sister, and not all the attention was welcome. A federal marshal named Pike arrived in the valley, asking questions about Sarah's bond papers and the circumstances of her purchase. "These documents are irregular," Pike announced, standing on their front porch with his hat in his hands and his badge glinting in the morning sun. "I have reason to believe this woman was sold under false pretenses." Josiah stepped protectively in front of Sarah. "What kind of false pretenses?" "The trader who sold her claimed she was a legal bond servant, debt contracted. But I've been investigating his operations, and it appears he was trafficking in stolen persons. This woman may need to be returned to her rightful owners." "I'm her rightful family," Josiah said, his voice dangerous. "According to what proof?" "You have no documentation of kinship, no legal standing. For all I know, you're in league with the traffickers." Sarah stepped forward, her chin raised. "I can prove who I am." She disappeared into the cabin and returned with a small wooden box. From inside, she withdrew a tarnished silver locket. "This belonged to our mother," she said, opening it to reveal a tiny daguerreotype. "Elizabeth McKenna, taken in 1847, the year before she died." Pike examined the locket, then looked from the photograph to Sarah and back again. The resemblance was unmistakable. "This proves nothing about your brother's identity," he said stubbornly. "Then maybe this will." Sarah rolled up her sleeve, revealing a small scar on her forearm shaped like a crescent moon. "Tell him how I got this, Josiah." Josiah smiled grimly. She was 8 years old, trying to help me shoe a horse. The mare spooked and kicked, caught her with the edge of the horseshoe. Anyone could have told him that story. Pike insisted. "What about this?" Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small carving, a wooden horse, crude but recognizable. "You made this for my 9th birthday. You said it was a Mustang that would carry me anywhere I wanted to go." Josiah took the carving with reverent hands. He'd thought it was lost forever in the raid. "You kept it all these years." "Hidden it in my shoe," Sarah said. "It was all I had left of home." Pike looked between them, his certainty wavering. "Mrs." Henderson chose that moment to arrive with several other Valley families in tow. They'd heard about the marshal's visit and come to show their support. "This girl's been nothing but a blessing to our community," Mrs. Henderson declared. "She's teaching our children and helping with the sick. If you try to take her away from her family again, you'll have to go through all of us." The other families murmured agreement. Old Henrik Larson stepped forward, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "I knew their father, Marcus McKenna," he said in his heavily accented English. "Good man. These two have the look of him. Both of them." Pike found himself outnumbered and outmaneuvered. He folded the bond papers and tucked them into his jacket. "I'll be filing a report with the territorial government," he said stiffly. "This matter may not be closed." After he'd ridden away, the families gathered on the porch for an impromptu celebration. Someone brought out a fiddle, and the Henderson girls convinced Sarah to dance. Josiah watched from the porch steps, feeling a contentment he hadn't known in 20 years. That night, as they cleaned up from the gathering, Sarah found him sitting by the dying fire. "Do you think he'll be back?" she asked. "Maybe. But it doesn't matter. You're home now, and home is worth fighting for." Sarah nodded, then sat beside him on the hearth. "I've been thinking about what Mrs. Henderson said about starting a real school. What about it? I'd like to try. Not just teaching the children to read, but teaching them about the world, about history and geography and all the things I learned in my travels." Josiah smiled. "Even the bad parts?" "Especially the bad parts. Children need to know that terrible things happen, but also that people survive them, that they can rebuild and find happiness again." "Sounds like a good lesson to me." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the embers glow. Outside, a nightbird called across the valley, and the wind sighed through the pines. Sarah leaned against her brother's shoulder, finally allowing herself to believe that this peace was real, that it would last. The next morning brought news that Marshal Pike had been arrested in Millerville for taking bribes from traffickers. His investigation had crumbled along with his credibility, and the territorial government declared Sarah's case closed. Within a month, Sarah had her school. The Valley families helped build a small schoolhouse near the creek, with windows facing east to catch the morning light. She started with 8 students and grew to 15 by Christmas. On the anniversary of her rescue, Josiah presented her with a hand-carved sign for the schoolhouse door. Sarah McKenna, teacher. Below that, in smaller letters, all children welcome. Sarah hung the sign herself, stepping back to admire their work. The little building looked exactly like the schoolhouse she dreamed of as a child. White-painted boards, a bell tower, and a yard where children could play. Ma would be proud, Josiah said, joining her in the doorway. Pa too, Sarah agreed. Remember how he always said education was the one thing no one could steal from you? Turns out he was right. As evening settled over the valley, brother and sister walked home together, their shadows stretching long across the prairie grass. The cabin glowed warm and welcoming in the twilight, smoke rising straight up from the chimney in the still air. Sarah paused at the gate, looking back at the schoolhouse one more time. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, new opportunities to build something good from the ashes of the past. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For never stopping. For believing I was alive when everyone else said I was dead. For recognizing my face in that terrible place. Josiah put his arm around her shoulders. Family finds family, little sister. Always. They stood there for a moment longer, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Then they went inside to supper and warmth and the simple blessing of being home. Don't forget to subscribe and consider giving a like to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.